Okay, it looks like we are live now. Good evening, everybody. This is Eviction and Law panel that goes as part of the programming for the Evicted exhibit at the Margaret Walker Center, and we are very thankful to the Mississippi Humanities Council for their generous support of this event and the rest of the events in this series. And today we have several wonderful panelists. I'm going to introduce them first, and then we're going to get to the questions that, together with the panelists, we have prepared for tonight. Our first panelist is Zakiyah Summers, the representative for House District 68. Zakiyah Summers is a servant leader and civil rights activist. She is currently serving her first term as state representative for House District 68, which covers portions of West and South Jackson, Byram, and Terry in Hinds County, and Pearl and Richland in Rankin County. She is former election commissioner for Hinds County District 3 and former director of communications and advocacy for the ACLU of Mississippi. For the past 10 years, she has led campaigns to address systematic barriers in the community at the intersections of voting rights, criminal justice, educational equity, healthcare access, and racial justice. Zakiyah is also a member of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated, where she serves as her chapter's social action chair and a W.K. Kellogg Foundation Community Leadership Network Fellow. She received her BA in broadcast journalism from the University of Missouri-Columbia. She and her husband have 3 sons and live in West Jackson. Our second panelist is John Joplin. John Joplin began his career as a law clerk for the Mississippi Supreme Court. He worked as a legal aid housing attorney for 10 years in Hattiesburg. He taught fair housing and landlord-tenant law at the University of Mississippi Law School Civil Legal Clinic before joining Mississippi Center for Justice in 2005. In 2006, he received the President's Award from the Mississippi State Bar for his work providing legal representation for individuals facing eviction in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Our third panelist is Keisha Stokes Huff. Keisha Stokes Huff was born in Jackson, Mississippi. She graduated from Lanier High School in 2003, Jackson State University in 2006, and Harvard Law School in 2009. Following law school, Keisha spent 3 years as a judicial law clerk for 2 federal judges, United States District Judge Stephen P. Mickle of the North District of Florida and United States Circuit Judge Carl E. Stewart of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. After completing her clerkships, Keisha worked as an assistant federal defender in Montgomery, Alabama, before joining the Southern Poverty Law Center in 2019. As part of SPLC's Economic Justice Project, her work focuses on addressing the root causes of poverty and ensuring that all people are treated justly regardless of economic status. Keisha serves on the board of Women in Training Incorporated, which provides basic hygiene supplies to help alleviate period poverty among the 25% of American young people who skip school or miss work because they cannot afford menstrual products. And finally, we have, last but not the least, we have Will Badwell. Will Badwell serves as a staff attorney in the Mississippi Center for Justice, Biloxi office. Will reports to the Housing Law Director in support of Fair Housing Act enforcement, fair housing education and outreach, and eviction defense. Will has secured over $100,000 in awards for victims of housing discrimination. Will also conducts housing policy and environmental law research for MCJ. Originally from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, he graduated cum laude from the University of Mississippi with a BA in Public Policy Leadership in 2015, and graduated cum laude from the University of Mississippi School of Law in 2018. He immediately joined MCJ after graduation. With help from the McLean Institute for Public Service and Community Engagement at the University of Mississippi and the Gulf Restoration Network, Will first partnered with MCJ during the summer of 2016 and drafted a white paper detailing Clean Water Act violations by publicly owned treatment works in the Mississippi Delta. Will had previously provided consultation to the United States Forest Service in the Black Creek and Leaf Wilderness areas. During law school, Will served as an advanced student in the low-income housing clinic. He also interned for Mississippi Supreme Court Justice Down H. Bean and the National Sea Grant Law Center. Finally, I'm Kate Mala, an assistant professor at the School of Architecture, Mississippi State University, and I'm going to be the moderator tonight. And with that, let's get to our discussion. And I'd love to start this discussion from a rather broad question, a question to all of the panelists, asking them to tell us a little bit more about their work that they do around evictions regionally and in Mississippi. Since we started with Representative Summers as our first bio, Representative Summers, are you there? Would you like to speak first? Let's see. Do we have any other volunteers to speak about their work around evictions first?
Kate, I'll begin by just saying that in mid to late March of 2020, the Center for Justice began to receive a large volume of calls from people who were unable to pay their rent because they had had an interruption in income that related to the coronavirus epidemic. And some of these individuals were already at the stage where they were receiving threats of eviction from their landlords. Others were just anxious because they didn't foresee an ability to pay their rent for the next month and the next month because they had been subjected to a layoff or a furlough. So the Mississippi Center for Justice established a statewide hotline in order to provide information to people who were in just that situation. And that grew into a broader level of service over the last year and a half, in which we have provided not only information about available moratoriums, information about rental assistance programs, advice about how to negotiate with your landlord when you were behind on your rent, and even actual legal representation in various courtrooms in the state, mostly in the southern part of the state. And that's been our level of service to this point.
Thank you, John. Would anybody else want to speak about their experience with evictions in Mississippi?
Well, I'll follow John because my experience is very similar. Of course, we've been running the eviction crisis hotline, and I think John and I would both say, and have told plenty of people before, Mississippi definitely in an eviction crisis now, but we were experiencing one even before the pandemic began. So in a lot of our work, especially fair housing enforcement, we find people that are facing retaliatory evictions because they've spoken up, because they've exercised their rights. The landlord is trying to get them out. So we were finding ourselves having to fight evictions in justice court even before the pandemic. And we know evictions are going to be an issue after. Pandemic isn't a good thing by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it has called people's attention to the fragility of housing in America.
Mm-hmm. And I'll go next. Can you all hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Excellent. For some reason I dropped, but I'm glad I'm back. So thanks again for having me. So as a state legislator, my job inside of the Capitol is to study and learn as much as I can about issues like housing and eviction, and then work to formulate policies and garner support to pass equitable bills that will benefit all Mississippians. As a state legislator outside of the Capitol, I work with individuals, organizations, businesses to bring resources to bear for the communities that I serve, and help to hold those individuals and agencies that are responsible for providing services and benefits accountable for making sure that they're doing that for the constituents that I represent. What I've learned as it relates to eviction in my short time as a legislator is that the pendulum has swung in the direction of the landlords, and the tenants have been left to dry with less rights, and that's due to recent legislation. So, I believe that with advocacy, public education, the help of the media, and the work of my good attorney friends that are on this panel, we can continue to bring attention to this issue and the harms of eviction, and hopefully work to correct some of these wrongs.
Thanks for the question, Kate, and thanks for having me. It's been really rewarding just hearing what my colleagues are doing in Mississippi, with Mississippi being my home. At Southern Poverty Law Center, we advocate across the South for housing to be recognized as a human right. During the pandemic, we've been very supportive of the eviction moratorium, and we've challenged eviction proceedings, particularly in New Orleans. One of our main goals at Southern Poverty Law Center is that protections for tenants are construed as broadly as possible to ensure fair outcomes. And during the pandemic, many people who've been struggling financially have resorted to living long-term in hotels and motels. So one policy that we've advocated for is that those people who are living long-term in hotels and motels receive the same tenancy protections as other people who are renting housing. And, one thing that we've learned, particularly in the Atlanta area, is the number of children who are living with parents in hotels and motels, and the danger that they're in if they're evicted, and how that could disrupt their schooling, how that would expose more people to COVID. And so housing has impacts beyond just where you lay your head. It has health impacts as well. And we try to raise awareness about that. We work to eliminate unfair barriers to housing. Immigration status is often a barrier that shouldn't exist, but does exist on a practical level. And we challenge that, as well as other inequitable barriers, including race, language access, and ability, making sure that people have access to housing despite any disabilities that they might have. And a final priority area for us around housing and evictions is that people who are experiencing housing insecurity are treated fairly and justly in our society. And something that people may not realize is that in places throughout the South, people are subject to criminal punishment if they're without a home and if they're asking for help. And so we've challenged prosecutions where people who are homeless or experiencing housing insecurity are being prosecuted just for asking for help or for assistance.
Thank you all. Keisha, this is a perfect segue to my next question that I think is a central question of this entire discussion. What are the major barriers to getting into fair housing situations in Mississippi and the South? Receiving rent assistance if necessary, finding help in eviction situations in Mississippi. I'm particularly curious about these categories that you mentioned: race, class, immigration status, language, and such.
Well, I'll start. I think a major barrier is information. When you're experiencing an eviction, it really is one of the most stressful times in your life. In Mississippi, a landlord just gives a written notice to you that he's evicting you, and you might not have information in that moment of how to protect yourself. There's no right to counsel in these situations. And so people, who are already struggling, if they're not legally sophisticated, then it's very easy for people to just be railroaded in situations like this. That's why the work of, my colleagues at Mississippi Center for Justice and other organizations who provide legal support is really important. But I think we all can do more to get information out to people who need it about how they can protect themselves and seek assistance.
I think that's such a very important point, Keisha, and I'm grateful for you for bringing it forth. I think the lack of access to counsel is central, and I think the inability to obtain free legal assistance in civil court at the housing court level is the primary driver of the rapidity of eviction in Mississippi. Mississippi has the 5th highest rate of evictions in the United States of America. That's not accidental. That's the result of a lack of procedural protections for tenants, particularly in terms of extremely short timeframes. But the fact that there is only one legal aid attorney for every 20,000 Mississippians living in poverty means that most people who receive an eviction notice are going to go to court without any representation whatsoever. So that's certainly where the trouble begins.
And I'll just add to that the law in and of itself, the 3-day notice law, is a huge barrier. I mean, when I think about the bills that I receive and the fact that I might be a couple of days late, doesn't mean that I get disconnected from that service. And so when you think about someone's shelter, their home where they're raising their family, only having 3 days notice to, leave the premises and be able to move all of their things and find something else in such a short period of time is a huge barrier. In addition to, not having access to legal counsel. As you all are aware, the state of Mississippi received tons of money to help individuals that were facing eviction and have been impacted by COVID. And the problem with that money is that it hadn't been getting out to the people who need it. Mm-hmm. And it's because the process is so convoluted and so burdensome. And so, what we decided to do, a group of colleagues and myself, we decided to host a ramp fair in the community because we said, what? We got to be able to bring this program to where the people are. You got to come outside of the office and make sure that folks can access this program. And then if you think about renters who, are likely of a low income, they may or may not have access to the internet. They may or may not have access to a computer, to a scanner, to the documents that they need. They may not understand the application and all that it entails in order to take advantage of the program, which is why it was important for us to host the fair so that they could speak to someone face to face and get those questions answered. And so, there are a lot of issues and a lot of barriers that come with accessing rental assistance.
Well, that brings up yet another question that goes pretty much with the previous one. Um, Representative Summers mentioned the practical ways of delivering this knowledge to the communities. What ways do we have of delivering this knowledge about what potential eviction assistance or the rights that tenants have to the community, and what's the best way of doing this during the pandemic? And what's the best way of doing it considering the largely rural population in Mississippi?
Well, I think that that's a really good question to be posed to the people who are running the rental assistance program in this state, because education and outreach is a central component to the delivery of any service, but certainly to the delivery of a service to people in underserved or rural communities, communities that are largely isolated and may not have the access to the internet that's been mentioned. We established the hotline because we felt like it was what we could do with the resources that we had. But we believe that information and outreach are a component of the rental assistance program's obligation to serve the people. I know that a lot of people, as the end of the CDC moratorium approached, many grassroots organizations began to mobilize to try and supplement these education and outreach efforts by providing them to local communities through fairs such as the one that Representative Summers mentioned, and other programs in which people literally assisted in helping individuals navigate the application process. But certainly more is needed, because the low level of delivery in terms of the amount of money that's been pushed to the people who need it versus the amount of money that was appropriated and made available to the state would reflect a great need for further education and outreach.
You know, when I was in advocacy, well, I'm still in advocacy, but when I did advocacy for the ACLU, one of our go-to groups was churches, because people in rural communities and you know, really the whole state of Mississippi is a rural state. They trust their pastors. They trust the people that they go to church with, and the church has the network and oftentimes the capacity to be able to get information out to people. So I would say, you know, partnering with churches, partnering with local elected officials, even, you know, officials like myself that represent districts, because people have, you know, obviously voted for us, so they trust us, and we have a voice. And we're also able to get information out. Some of the things that I do as a state rep is I go on radio talk shows and talk about what's available. I share things on social media, send out e-blasts, you know, panels like this one that's being hosted by the Margaret Walker Alexander Center with experts like, you know, the folks that we have on the panel tonight, you know, help to get information out, legitimate information, because we hear a lot of misinformation, but true and accurate information matters, right? And so getting that out, you know, in the various mechanisms that we have access to help. I also partner with a church in my neighborhood, Rosemount MB Church. And we always do events and programs in the community, because the community that I live in and that I represent is a low income community. And so we like to meet people where they are and engage with them and have them to come in and tell us, you know, what is it that you need, and then try to bring that service to the community so that they can have access to that.
I completely agree with Representative Summers that it's important to take a multi-factor approach to outreach and public education. And definitely our community institutions, including churches, are a big part of that. Another major community institution throughout our state is our college system. And, you know, Mississippi is very rural, as you said, Kate, but we have colleges and universities dotted throughout our state. Which could really be a hub for getting resources and information to communities that need them. An added benefit when working with colleges and universities is you have, you know, a large amount of volunteers, students who care about these issues, who care about justice, and who want to work. And also, people are more likely to trust information that they get from colleges and universities than they might get from other sources. And I think we can capitalize on that. Definitely at SPLC, we are excited and happy to partner with colleges and universities in the states that we work in. We're especially excited to work with HBCUs. I'm excited to be on this panel, you know, for my alma mater, Jackson State University. And I think, you know, we can make these connections and develop these relationships in ways that are most impactful for our communities.
Absolutely, and that makes a lot of sense that there would be, as a representative of a college, I suppose, it makes a lot of sense that universities would be an excellent, and colleges would be an excellent hub for delivering this information. With that mention of how complicated and lengthy the process of applying for rental assistance may be, I'm wondering, what do you think about this strange discrepancy that exists between how easy to evict somebody and how fast that process can be in Mississippi, and how complicated and lengthy the bureaucracy of receiving assistance ends up being? And I'm particularly interested in, how do you think it came to be that an eviction may be a 3-day or a 3-day eviction notice and 5 to 10 days in court, if I'm understanding the process correctly? How did the legal situation in Mississippi become like that? What is the history of eviction laws in Mississippi when it comes to the procedures, and why are they so lightning fast in comparison to rental assistance bureaucracies?
Well, I'll speak to that. And Mississippi, in the early 90s, they actually passed the Mississippi Residential Landlord-Tenant Act, and it finally said, hey, there's real obligations on the landlord. And that and our other statute helped specify the system so that people knew the rules of the playing field. And there was a lot of good law there. But recently, the process has sped up immensely. So it has for a while now been that it's all a landlord has to do is give a 3-day notice, then file an affidavit in court, show up in court, and very often, especially with a non-payment issue, they're going to win. The tenant is going to be evicted. But used to, until very recently, our system showed some level of grace, some common sense policy that said we've got to give people some time to move, even if they lose and they're behind on rent. Some time to appeal if they felt like they've been wronged, or to make arrangements. And in 2019, Mississippi's legislature and the governor changed that law. And so now Mississippi law requires the judge, when he issues an eviction, to, if the landlord wants it to be immediate, he has to say it's immediate and give a warrant of removal for the constable. So now we have the real possibility and occurrence of same-day evictions. Not only that, the law now also says if you can't get everything out, even if you're removed immediately, it automatically becomes the property of the landlord. And that doesn't matter if it's family heirlooms, if it's medications, whatever it is. And we, at the Mississippi Center for Justice, we think it's unconstitutional, these new laws. And I think it's clear to everyone, even people who aren't a lawyer, that they're unfair and they're bad policy. And there's a case that's challenged it now in the federal court in the Northern District of Mississippi. It's the case Connor versus Alton. And that case isn't over yet, but the judge just issued an order, said he's not saying whether it's unconstitutional or not yet, but he calls it indefensible, bad policy, says it doesn't serve any constituency in the long run in Mississippi. And he really said the legislature needs to look at it and fix it. And I won't rule until the legislative session's over, in his hope that they fix it. So we're working hard to let everyone know that the law should change. I mean, it's just, we've looked at all 50 states. Nowhere is as fast. Nowhere is so egregious when it comes to how it treats tenants' property. So 3-day notice isn't very long to even prepare for court or make arrangements. But at least we used to have a system that said if you lost, we're not going to irreparably, immediately throw you out on the curb. But now we have that. It's been a real step backwards so quickly.
Well, that just reminds me of the case that is unfortunately happening in Starkville right now, Starkville, where I am at with Mississippi State. You may have heard of our situation with an apartment complex that is being mass evicted, and it is not being mass evicted due to delayed rent. It is being mass evicted because the landlord changed, and it seems that the new landlord has different plans for the building. So tenants received 3-day eviction notices, and all of that was also happening right before the last hurricane. So it was very problematic on many levels. That makes me wonder, what can tenants do in case of a mass eviction like this? How does the situation change? What are their possibilities? What should be their plan of action?
Well, again, obtaining counsel is so important because a tenant should not be expected to figure out how to keep a new owner of a building from conducting a mass eviction. It's just not within the ordinary level of knowledge that somebody would have who's renting from an apartment complex. You mentioned that it was not a non-payment situation, but you also mentioned that they gave a 3-day notice. The 3-day notice is precisely to be used in instances of non-payment of rent. And in instances where there's another reason, actually there should be a longer amount of notice. So it seems to me that just on the face of it, there might have been an intervention opportunity based on the use of an improper notice. But of course, I can't say for sure, but it would have been important for an attorney to be there in order to raise any of the arguments that could have been advanced for the benefit of all those people who were about to be put out on such short notice right before a hurricane and in the middle of a pandemic with such a high transmission rate as recently Mississippi has had. I did see that there had been a settlement of that case just today, and I'm looking forward to learning more about that. As best I can tell, it provides some additional time for the tenants to make a plan to relocate, but it does not alter the fact that they're going to be losing their housing.
John, thank you. That is exactly what happened, and I guess it's to sort of follow with all of your arguments about the importance of information. That would have not happened if the fact of this mass eviction did not become known, and people who had access to information did not start participating in what was going on. And yes, indeed, the tenants will have some extra time, although in a university town like Starkville, it's still difficult to find housing,
Sure.
even within that period of time. Yes, it's still a difficult situation. But that also makes me wonder, so what does an eviction case, or what does a situation like this look like from a perspective of a judge? What is the role of a judge in the crisis, or of judges in the crisis that we're seeing unwrapping? What is the role of landlords themselves? What does an eviction look like from a perspective of a landlord? Could somebody speak to that?
In Mississippi, most of the eviction proceedings originate and end in the justice court. And what many people in Mississippi don't realize is that justice court judges aren't required to be attorneys in their background, or have legal training, or have gone to law school. But they end up handling situations that are the most important types of legal decisions that many people will experience in their lives. Whether they can remain in their home is one. They make really important decisions in criminal cases. Whether a person will remain incarcerated pending trial is another one. In Mississippi, we know that people spend years in jail prior to trial without any conviction. They're innocent until proven guilty, but they're incarcerated prior to trial anyway. So evictions in these criminal cases are really important legal decisions with practical consequences in people's lives. But the people on the front line making those decisions aren't attorneys often, and don't have advanced legal training on these types of matters when they make these decisions. So that's an important structural difference in Mississippi from other states with more progressive and protective policies. And I think just raising awareness about that is an important first step. I think it's a vestige of an earlier time when there weren't many attorneys and there weren't many law schools. But now there are many more attorneys. 3 of us are on the call. At this point, you can throw a rock and hit one of us anywhere. And so I think there's more room now for attorneys to handle a lot more of these important, critical decisions. And I think we can do more to shift responsibility for these.
You know, it's so important to listen to Akeisha bring forth the fact that these various elements that we're hearing about, first, the short 3-day notice, you know, second, as Will brings forth, immediate removal. Thirdly, decision makers who are not required to have a legal education. I think that probably more will be brought forth in the course of our time together, but to begin to realize that these are the elements that add up to Mississippi having the 5th highest rate of eviction in the country. It's a function of the smooth pathway that's been paved on behalf of the people who own property, and the failure to establish any guardrails or protections for the people whose circumstances require them to rent their shelter from such people.
And Kate, can I just add that, you know, justice court judges are elected officials. Okay, they are elected by the people. And so this brings, forth the critical point of voting and being civically engaged. If you see that this individual is not performing well, not being fair, you have to show some compassion to people when you're in public service. They may promise all of these things when they're campaigning and they're asking for your vote, but the proof is in the pudding. And so if you see that these individuals are not living up to those things and they're not serving the communities in the way that they should be, meet them at the ballot box and mobilize your community. Organize folks at your church, in your homes, in your neighborhoods. Do voter registration drives. Get people involved in our elections because they're elected every 4 years. And you yourself, we just learned that, you only need, is it a high school diploma? Is that right, to run for justice court judge? So if you want to run for judge, my sister, my brother, do it. Because what we can't do is to allow people to use their position in a way that hurts and harms other people in other communities. So get engaged, vote, run for office if you can, and let's, create the change that we want to see.
I think Representative Summers makes a wonderful point in that it made me think back to what is happening in Starkville. That's a group of everyday people who got together and stood up to injustice and realized, hey, it's just not me being wronged. It's all my fellow Mississippians. And I think there's power in that. And of course, I got on my soapbox earlier about the recent changes to the law. Well, that happened because landlords, apartment owners got their representatives to introduce legislation and passed it real quick. And meanwhile, everyone else was caught astounded by that. So we've got to all pay attention, work together to get more equity, more fairness in the system.
Absolutely. And then there's a question of what happens after evictions. And it seems that what happens after evictions oftentimes is so much more difficult to address than what happens prior to evictions, than the housing insecurity itself, that it seems that these things need to be addressed ahead of time, of course. And that brings up one of my other general questions. As public, what should we do to address this crisis? Representative Summers mentioned voting. Representative Summers also mentioned being active citizens and participating when we see an opportunity. Will also mention the very same role that the broader community may have in an eviction crisis or a mass eviction crisis. But when it's an individual eviction, it's not as visible as a mass eviction of an entire apartment complex. What can we do other than properly participating in the voting process? Is there anything else that we should be doing while this is all happening?
Well, I just read one of the comments that I think was shared on Facebook from my good friend Tarisha, and it's just so good to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. And she made a comment about, how enlightening this series has been. And I think that just, speaks to the point of having these conversations on platforms that people can have access to. And just to plug, the Margaret Walker Alexander Center has an exhibit there on the campus of Jackson State that people should take advantage of and learn about this issue, because, it may just be a matter of time before someone who could be facing an eviction. And because you participated in this panel or saw the exhibit, you can provide some information to that individual that helps them in that process. I read an article where there was a renter who had been evicted but through the legal process, she actually won her case. It took some time. And I think that's not my attorney friends, I don't think that that's a usual outcome. The renters don't typically win, but she did win in this one. And it was because she did her homework and she went to that courthouse. She was persistent in making sure that they did not violate her rights. So this panel is about knowing your rights. Knowing your rights is so important. And if you don't know your rights, then give a call to the Mississippi Center for Justice. Give a call to SPLC, ACLU, NAACP. There are a number of organizations across the state that will give you a training right in your own home, in your backyard, on the computer. We're putting up there the hotline number that you can call and get the information that you need. And then when you get the information, share it with someone. Because knowledge is power. And the more that we know, the more that we can protect ourselves and we can protect those that are around us. And then know who your legislator is. Know who the people that represent you are. And establish a relationship with them. Right now, we're not in session, which means that we are in the communities that we represent. Find out who represents you in the House and in the Senate. Feel free to give a call to the speaker, the lieutenant governor, or the governor. We work for you. Our job is to represent you. And if you're having an issue, whether it's eviction, an eviction issue or otherwise, we can take that information back when we do go back into session. We can hold legislative hearings. We can get support from organizations that can help us lobby for changes in the law or new laws that we need to pass. Obviously, this 3-day notice law that was passed in 2019 is not working the way that maybe, well, let me take that back. Maybe they did intend for it to work the way that it's working, but it's certainly not working for the people. Let's put it that way. And we know what kind of environment that we're in at the Capitol. We may not necessarily have the political will to change it, but we sure can make a lot of noise about it. And one thing that I've learned, especially when I was working at the ACLU, is if you can't get it done through policy, there's always litigation. And litigation sometimes can put the pedal to the metal and force policymakers, legislators to do what we're supposed to do in righting the wrong that's within that particular law.
Representative Summers, I have a practical question with that. When you call your representative, when you call your legislators, what are you asking for? What exactly should you be asking for?
Well, I think, the first thing is if you don't know what to ask for, is just to find out who they are. Find out, what area do you represent? Which committees do you serve on? Because if you're on a particular committee, like in the House, we don't have a housing committee, but in the Senate we do. And so if your senator serves on that committee, then they can have direct input on policies that affect housing before it comes over to the House. But certainly you want to get to know them just to establish a relationship with them. Then you may want to ask, hey, what are some of the things that you're working on as you prepare for the next session? Or if there was an issue that you read about or heard about, or an assistance program that you heard about or read about, you can ask your legislator, hey, do you mind giving me some more information or sharing information with me? If you happen to be an expert on a particular area, then you can tell your legislator, well, you know what, I have expertise in this area. Would you be willing to work with me so that I can give you the information that will help to inform the work that you do? And we always welcome that, because we are not the experts. Our job is to make sure that we are responsive to the people that we represent. And so it shouldn't just be the lobbyists Like Will said, you know, the big lobbyists like the landlords and the realtors that are informing policy, because they're looking out for their bottom line, for their interests, and may not be necessarily looking out for the interests of the people. And so when you call on us, tell us, you know, I have a certain expertise in this area. I want to offer this information, something that you may have not thought about or known about. And we can take that information and help to formulate policy around that.
I think at the Mississippi Center for Justice, we view this problem as a very big one, but one that is subject to being attacked strategically from several different angles. Certainly one is the legislative angle. And I think the decision that Will was discussing that Judge Mills rendered in the Connor case, in which he admonished basically the legislature to take corrective action regarding this same-day eviction statute, provides an opportunity for public interest and civil rights, social justice lawyers to offer to the legislature their expertise about how to improve the law so that it would pass constitutional muster and extend a reasonable amount of time following an eviction for people to gather their family together and their belongings, locate a new place, and move. That's the legislative angle. From a judicial angle, the best way to attack these laws is through an appeal after an eviction has been rendered. But that's particularly vexing because people who are evicted don't have enough money to post the 125% bond that's required in order to stop an eviction by appeal. And so I would ask my sister lawyers and my brother lawyers to, if they care about these issues, to consider contacting the state bar and volunteering to render pro bono assistance to people before they're evicted, but also after they're evicted, during the 30-day period in which they have to file an appeal. That's how the Connor case got before Judge Mills, was because it was a rare example of an eviction that actually wound up being appealed and then, in this case, taken into federal court, which resulted in judicial oversight. Most of the decisions that are made at the justice court level are never subjected to any type of judicial oversight. And so we can talk about it as lawyers and non-lawyers and concerned citizens on a panel, but we probably need to make more, take more strategic action steps at the legislative and at the judicial level in order to turn the situation around.
John, since you mentioned that the current challenge to the existing Mississippi laws is coming from a case that happened after the tenant was evicted, what happens after an eviction from a legal standpoint? What are the possibilities? What should a tenant do if the eviction already took place?
Well, you know, and I'm going to ask Will to speak to this as well, but with same-day eviction, if the gavel comes down and the judge orders an immediate lockout, or even in the more lenient case in which a lockout occurs 72, 48 hours later, there isn't much time to act. And at that point, those of us who work with communities who face eviction regularly have learned that one of the most important things to do is to push out information about rapid rehousing programs and emergency solution grant money. There's money out there for the purpose of helping people avoid homelessness and permitting people to be rapidly rehoused. And so frequently you are in the position, Kate, unfortunately, of triage, damage mitigation, but it doesn't stop the harm. You've got the harm to the children whose education is interrupted. You've got the harm to the health of the family who's put out on the curb in the middle of a pandemic. You've got the long-term harm to the ability to find another place to rent because they have an eviction on their record, and the damage to their credit rating that in this day and age of technology is going to follow them forever, because it is almost automatic that an eviction will be placed on your record and that you will have problems finding housing in the future. And that's just in the private market. If you're in the public housing sector, you won't be housed again in a public housing for at least 3 years. So it's grim following an eviction. And I wish I could present a better picture or say something more positive. That's why I propose using the tools of filing appeals, public interest lawyers filing appeals, taking these cases into federal court, obtaining injunctions. That's what the attorneys for Ms. Connor did. Again, we don't have a sufficient amount of resources to support a public interest law action in the state of Mississippi. And we need more lawyers to come forth and participate in working together, linking arms to make some strategic decisions and take significant action steps on this particular issue. This is the issue. We don't have to do everything today, and we don't do everything tomorrow. But if we can agree that eviction is so devastating and harmful and such a bad, has such bad consequences for society and for everyone involved, and work on that issue and get enough people to focus on that, then there's maybe some light at the end of the tunnel. But it's going to require a change in the law. We know this at the Mississippi Center for Justice. We know that these impacts don't fall haphazardly, but that they fall particularly on communities of color, and they fall even more particularly on women who are members of communities of color. We've serviced over 475 callers in the last 15 months. 67% of them have been African American. They either facing eviction or they're fearful that they're going to face eviction because they can't pay their rent. 67% of those callers are African American. And of those 67%, 60% are women. So it mirrors the information that is so explicitly displayed at the eviction exhibit at the Margaret Walker Center, in which all of those statistics are shown nationwide about the impacts of eviction on different communities. And going back to, the point that Keisha made about the structural processes that make this possible, there is nothing accidental happening here. This is not happening because people have done anything wrong. This is happening because the rules are working against ordinary people and in favor of people who have already made it in society.
I see a question in the comment section that seems to be quite related to what you were saying, John, or rather a comment. The comment from Shayla Malone that says, legislators who are also rental properties owners should not be allowed to introduce legislation. With that, Do you know of any examples of restrictions like that, where a lobby from landlords would not be possible in the lawmaking situation? Or is that not something that has ever happened in Mississippi or other contexts?
I don't know if that has happened in the past, but I can tell you based on my experience at the state capitol, if you are a landlord or a funeral home director or a barber or hairstylist, typically those legislators will not vote. They will abstain from supporting or opposing those pieces of legislation. I'm not sure if that might be a rule in our rule book, but I know ethically they abstain from doing that. And if it's not a written rule, it's definitely an understood rule that we don't vote on those measures if you are within that particular industry. So I haven't experienced that happening.
Representative Summers, this is an interesting gray area. You mentioned somebody who is a barber who would not participate in the legislation that has to do with barbershops. But the thing about the landlord seems to be that a landlord is not what you do, right? You can be a landlord and do something completely different. And we know in current day situations that large amounts of real estate belong to people who do not necessarily just live within that real estate, but also rent it out. So the society is now rather curious in its structure. There are people who don't own any housing, and then there are folks who own a lot of housing. It's a great ethical question when it comes to lawmaking. How do you separate landlords from non-landlords, I guess?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. I can only speak from my experience, and we do have realtors who are legislators because, legislating is not the only job that we have. But as I said, I see them abstaining when those bills come up. So, I could be wrong, but that's based on my experience. I did want to speak to something that John mentioned about, this not being an accident. And we know that policies forever have been influenced by racism, have been influenced by discrimination. And all of that has created, this residential segregation where there are, some folks that are able to live the American dream of home ownership. And there are other folks who don't. Policies have made it very hard for Black families to be able to own land, to be able to access homes, financing for homes, etc. And therefore, Black people, people of color, poor people end up concentrated in these high poverty areas. And you're left with mostly renters. So it's no accident if you look at the city of Jackson that we have a high concentration of families who live in poverty-stricken neighborhoods. And that contributes to something that you said, Kate, very early in this conversation. That has impacts on our health, that has impacts on our education, on a lack of employment opportunities and other outcomes. So, we wonder why our schools look the way that they look, or why we are dodging potholes on the way to work or on the way to church. And it's because we don't have the ad valorem taxes. We don't have the revenue from those taxes that help to generate funds that cities and school districts can use for things like infrastructure. Well, why is that? Because we don't have the homeowners. We have renters. We have mostly renters. I know in where I live, we have mostly renters. So it's absolutely no accident. And we know the history of Mississippi. All of that plays into why we are experiencing eviction in the way that we're experiencing it right now.
Absolutely. The history seems to play a key role in the current day crisis that we're experiencing. And that was actually one of my other questions that I sort of didn't want to impose over the Q&A, but perhaps if you, in your answers, you could briefly speak to that as well. What's the history of the eviction law in Mississippi sort of in a long run? Will spoke to the recent changes in the law for the worse. We're hoping for changes for the better in the future. What exactly happened with evictions in Mississippi earlier, throughout 20th century, perhaps prior to the 1990s, when the legislation was still a tiny bit more favorable towards tenants?
Kate, the simple answer to that question is that prior to 1989, when the Residential Landlord Tenant Act was adopted, which was built from a uniform Residential Landlord Tenant Act that was used in a vast number of states throughout America, Mississippi's laws regarding landlord-tenant were positively feudal in terms of their intricacy, both intricacy in the individual provisions, but also in intricacy in the way that they had to be pled and the way motions had to be filed, so that it would have been almost impossible for somebody who didn't have a legal education to negotiate their way through that thicket. So the laws were just absolutely Byzantine in terms of their complexity. But what they did that was very simple was support an agrarian system of sharecropping, basically. And they were adopted at a time when the power in Mississippi State Legislature was concentrated in the Delta, and they arose from the social structure and the economic structure that was then in place in the Delta, which was a form of after the fact servitude, after the fact of slavery, after the emancipation of slavery, a system of servitude arose that served as a substitute for the same class of people who had been the economic beneficiaries of slavery. And so under that system, if somebody tried to get off the farm and they left their place, and they didn't pay their fees to the landholder, they could lose their tools, any of their livestock, any of their possessions, sort of much like the 2019 amendment. They could lose that stuff immediately. And that's where the extremely, I think, punitive and cruel aspect of these laws began to be apparent, that this was not just about economic recovery of what a landlord was entitled to. It was about punishment to those people for having the audacity to want to improve their lives by moving off of the farm and by keeping a system of, the company store in place that promoted continued indebtedness on the part of these laboring farm workers. So you were always behind on your rent. And as somebody who likes to look to the future, I do not enjoy explaining that. I don't like answering that question because it's so not pretty, and it's so not flattering for a state that I love. And I think that It must, however, be confronted because it is the basis of all our pre-1989 eviction statutes. And I worry very much about moving backwards from the 1989 advancements to 2019 and seeing some of these similar punitive, harsh provisions enacted into law.
This is just such an important moment that what we're facing these days is nothing new and that it has been built into the system, sadly. And nothing surprising, nothing new, very predictable and tragic. Well, while we may still have some more questions, I want to address a couple of logistical questions quickly. Yes, this will be recorded, and the recording will be available after the live is over. And please take a moment to fill out a survey that Margaret Walker Center page is going to have about these events and this kind of programming. And what I see in the comments right now is that people really care about the history, the long history of distribution of privilege in Mississippi when it comes to housing security, when it comes to evictions. And that history should be brought up to the surface. As a historian, as an architectural historian, I feel that that's particularly important, that we understand this is not random and not new.
And thank you, Kate, for bringing that forward in this discussion this afternoon. And thank the Margaret Walker Center for inviting us to be on this panel and engage in these complicated and not altogether easy conversations around a situation that has proved to be quite intractable over time.
So a question that we got in the comments: what happens to rental assistance programs if the money is not used entirely, especially since the money is not getting to the people? The other day I was reading that it's nationally it's something like 98% of the money that was allocated towards rental assistance during the pandemic that did not get used. I may be getting the number wrong, but it was shocking in any case.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And I think there was one deadline that had been run into on some pot of money by virtually every state that was extended. So hopefully, we hope there'll be some extensions to keep getting the money out. But ultimately, eventually, we would suspect, and I think we've seen it in the past, that eventually it's reprogrammed for something else that hopefully is similarly aligned with the need, but won't be direct rental assistance. So I think that question is good. It's imperative that it gets out. It's going to help more people right now. It's going to help more people 6 months ago, 12 months ago. But that failures so far are no excuse for inaction going forward. I think there's good examples in certain states where agencies have said, we're not just going to put it online and hope people get to it, but are going into their communities and finding the people that need it, meeting them where they are, getting them the assistance. We've talked about the need for information and that social media isn't everything. Traditional media anymore isn't, but in Mississippi, we've got people that know each other in communities that go to church with each other, that can find each other and know who's hurting and who needs. Too often, I think we're all siloed in our own place in the state, and we're not networking and connecting. So I know John and I and others, I think, have realized even more and started to do that we all have to reach out to parts of the state that John and I are on the coast. We're far away from a lot of it, but we got to be plugged in there to help those people.
There's been some important. Go ahead, Keisha, please.
I was going to say, I think that question is really important. I think when it comes to federal dollars and federal emergency funding, that's an area where there really should be more accountability. And I think as advocates and civil rights attorneys, we should pursue that, including in conjunction with the federal government. When the federal government is giving this emergency funding, it not only obligates states to disperse the funding to people who happen to show up, but it also places obligations on states to do outreach, to find those people. As we've said many times, Mississippi is a largely rural state. And so if you're depending on people to come to population centers and to know what to look for and to know what money to seek, then that money is not going to be spent. But in issuing this money to Mississippi, the federal government is also placing the obligation on them to find people where they are, to reach them, to get information out about these programs. And if they're not doing that, then action should be taken and accountability should be had.
Keisha, I have a follow-up question to that. So who in the state is supposed to specifically work on that outreach? Is it somebody from Jackson who approaches smaller communities elsewhere in the state? Or is it the small cities, small towns that approach somebody in Jackson? How exactly does this work logistically?
The agency who receives the funding and is managing the funding should manage the outreach. I think that outreach can be outsourced. The agency can work directly with local governments, for instance, or like we talked about, the agency could work with churches or colleges and universities, community organizations to get the word out. This is a problem that hasn't only appeared in terms of rental assistance during the pandemic, but also things like vaccinations, testing for COVID. We really haven't been as deliberate as we should be in getting information to the people about what they need to do to protect themselves during the pandemic in, a holistic fashion. And I think the rental aspect is just part of it. And Mississippi and the agencies that are administering these federal dollars should really do more. And I think as advocates, social justice advocates, we should be raising awareness about this failure as well.
Keisha's absolutely right. The agency that's responsible for the rental assistance dollars is Mississippi Home Corps. And Mississippi Home Corps then also provided some monies for Hinds County and Harrison County, I believe. Mm-hmm. Those are the larger populated counties in the state of Mississippi, so that they could do additional outreach. I'll tell you, just from the outside looking in, one of the problems that, I see when these agencies get this money, one of the problems is that there are no real instructions on how they get the money out. And so they have so many questions about, well, can we use this money for month-to-month renters? We're worried about fraud. They throw that in the mix, really as a way, in my opinion, to keep them from doing their job. But I digress. Also, these agencies, while they are experts in their particular area, they are not experts when it comes to outreach and community engagement and marketing and public relations. And so there's an opportunity there for those agencies to then partner with social justice organizations that oftentimes already have a footprint in the community and have a network that they can then get information out to. And so there's an opportunity for agencies on their end, but also for churches and all the other organizations that we've mentioned already on the panel that can get in contact with your legislator, get in contact with the executive director of the agency and say, hey, we know you're having problems with this. Look, we have a community of 5,000 people that need help. We need you to come and set up in Jefferson Davis County or wherever that situation is. So again, as Will said, you can meet people where they are.
Well, I'm hearing that we're supposed to wrap up this excellent conversation, and I really hate to, but it is getting late. I'd like to thank all of you. I think this was incredibly helpful in practical ways as well as just theoretic understanding of what is going on. And hopefully the recording that's going to be out there is going to be helpful as well. And just a little reminder, there is going to be an evaluation on the Mississippi Humanities Council page. If you'd like more panels like this, if you'd like more programming like this, please participate. And please visit the Evicted exhibition at Margaret Walker Center, Jackson State campus. It's going to be open until October 3rd, I believe. Finally, once again, thank you to Mississippi Humanities Council for supporting this incredibly important program and topic. Thank you all so much. Good night.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Kate.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Nice.
Good night.
Good night.